What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Where is Noah's Ark? Here's why it will never be found. For more than a century, people have sought the precise location of Noah's Arkansas. Archaeologists say it's a fool's errand. Noah's Ark is among the best known and most captivating of all Old Testament stories. After creating humans, God became so displeased with them that he struck earth with an all-encompassing flood to wipe them out. But there was one noteworthy and seaworthy exception: the biblical patriarch and his family. Accompanied by pairs of each of the planet's animals, all rode out the deluge in an enormous wooden vessel. For people who accept the religious text as a historically accurate account of actual events, the hunt for archaeological evidence of the Ark is equally captivating. It's inspired some intrepid faithful to comb the slopes of Mount Ararat and other sites in eastern Turkey for traces of the wooden vessel among the rock formations. In 1876, for example, British attorney and politician James Bryce climbed the mountain, where biblical accounts say the Ark came to rest. There he claimed a piece of wood that suits all the requirements of the case was in fact a piece of the vessel. More modern discoveries exclaiming Noah's Ark found take place on a regular basis. Most recently, a group called Noah's Ark Scans, led by Andrew Jones, claims that soil samples taken from the Durupanar site in eastern Turkey contains organic matter that differs from the surrounding area. However, many argue the boat-shaped site is a natural geological formation. Such searches for the Ark site draw everything from exasperation to disdain from academic archaeologists and biblical scholars. No legitimate archaeologist does this, says National Geographic explorer Jody Magnus, an archaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, of modern searches for evidence of Noah. Archaeology is not treasure hunting, she adds. It's not about finding a specific object. It's a science in which we ask ourselves research questions and hope to find answers through excavation. Was the Old Testament flood fact or fiction? Stories of destructive floods and those who survived them predate the Hebrew Bible, the oldest parts of which are thought to have been written in the 8th century BC. Legends about a deluge that destroys civilization at the behest of a supernatural deity appear in multiple Mesopotamian texts. They run the gamut, from the Epic of Gilgamesh written around the early 2nd millennium BC to a recently deciphered Babylonian cuneiform tablet from about 1750 BC describing how the Ark was built. Could these flood myths be based in fact? There does seem to be geological evidence that there was a major flood in the Black Sea region about 7,500 years ago, says National Geographic explorer Eric Klein, an archaeologist at George Washington University. But scientists disagree on the extent of that event, just as historians of the era differ on whether real life inspired writings about a deluge. It seems more likely that floods were simply experienced in various locations and at various times, and that these occurrences naturally entered the world's oral and written lore, similar to the flood story in Genesis. Where is Noah's Ark? It's complicated. Scholars differ on the precise location of Noah's Ark according to the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Genesis, the Ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat located in the ancient kingdom of Urartu, an area that now includes Armenia and parts of eastern Turkey and Iran, not the single, iconic peak that bears its name today. There's no way we can determine where exactly in the ancient Near East it occurred, says Magnus. Both Klein and Magnus add that even if artifacts from the Ark have been or will be found, they could never be conclusively connected to historical events. We have no way of placing Noah if he really existed, and the flood if there really was one, in time and space, says Magnus. The only way you could determine that would be if you had an authentic ancient inscription. Even then, she points out, such an inscription could refer to another Noah or another flood. That hasn't stopped the proliferation of pseudo-archaeology that upholds the Bible as literal truth. The fruitless searches are often aligned with adherents of young Earth creationism, the belief that, despite evidence to the contrary, Earth is only thousands of years old. Same evidence, very different conclusions. Such groups use secular archaeological evidence to bolster their literal interpretation of Scripture, and simply disregard or attempt to disprove evidence to the contrary. But they don't all share the same tactics. Answers in Genesis, a self-described apologetic ministry that focuses on scientific issues and even runs a Noah's Ark-themed amusement park in Kentucky, acknowledges the ubiquity of flood-related myths beyond the Old Testament story of Noah, and even concedes that the Ark could never be found. Andrew A. states, "We do not expect the Ark to have survived and been available for finding after 4,350 years." Snelling, a geologist and director of research for Answers in Genesis who has spent decades attempting to prove Earth's youth. Snelling differs from archaeologists, however, about why the vessel's remains will never be found. With no mature trees available for Noah and his family to build shelters after they got off the Ark, there is every reason to expect they dismantled the Ark, which they didn't need anymore, to salvage timber from it, he says. While the ministry does not rule out the potential of one day finding the Ark, Snelling rues what he calls questionable claims by Ark seekers that blunt the potential impact of a true discovery. For Magnus, who currently leads excavations at a late Roman synagogue in Galilee, the search for Noah's Ark not only confuses the public, but diminishes excitement about actual archaeological finds, even ones that offer support for parts of the Bible, such as the existence of the House of David. "We know a lot about the biblical world, and it's very interesting," she says. Setting the record straight. Part of the problem, says Klein, is that the public has unrealistic expectations of the discipline of archaeology. Additionally, popular media highlights the thrill of the chase instead of the slow accretion of archaeological knowledge. "We're not like Indiana Jones," he says. "It's a scientific procedure. It's painstaking. But what excites us does not necessarily excite other people." Klein says when he was younger, he attempted to rebut the purported biblical evidence that enchants the public year after year. Eventually, he quit. Now he focuses on both his expeditions and translating his research for those willing to accept the results of the scientific process. He sighs. "People are going to believe what they want to believe. That won't change any time soon." For now, he's focused on unearthing an 18th century BC Canaanite palace at Tel Kabri in what is now northern Israel. "For us, the floor is incredibly important, because it shows international relations and contacts from almost 4,000 years ago," he says. "It's not Noah's Ark, but it's a painted floor," the archaeologist says, "which is good enough for me." Believers, adventurers, pseudo-archaeologists, and conspiracy theorists have all been captivated by the idea that the petrified remains of a massive wooden vessel that once saved the world from divine annihilation can be found somewhere, possibly high in the mountains of modern-day Turkey, Armenia, or Iran. The story of Noah's Ark, originating in the Hebrew Bible, tells of a patriarch chosen by God to survive a catastrophic flood sent to cleanse the earth of human wickedness. Obedient and righteous, Noah built an ark of gopher wood, gathered 2 of every living creature, and weathered the storm that raged for 40 days and nights. The floodwaters eventually receded, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, where Noah, his family, and their cargo of animals descended to repopulate the planet. It's a story deeply ingrained in Judeo-Christian culture, familiar to Sunday school children and Hollywood filmmakers, and it has endured not only as scripture but also as a tantalizing mystery for real-world explorers convinced that the Ark must be more than just a parable, that it must be, in fact, a historical artifact waiting to be discovered. For over a century, these seekers have ventured to the wild, rugged terrain of eastern Turkey and beyond, chasing rumors, deciphering ancient texts, and poring over satellite images, all in pursuit of a single goal: to prove that Noah's Ark is real. Yet despite countless expeditions, breathless media reports, and so-called breakthroughs, no scientifically verified trace of the Ark has ever been found, and there are very good reasons to believe it never will be. The notion that Noah's Ark exists as a recoverable archaeological relic is enticing but deeply flawed. Serious archaeologists dismiss such pursuits as pseudoscience or worse, a fundamental misunderstanding of what archaeology is and how it works. "No legitimate archaeologist does this," declares Jody Magnus, a National Geographic explorer and archaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The search for Noah's Ark, she argues, isn't science. It's treasure hunting disguised as theology, and it distracts from actual evidence-based study of the ancient world. Archaeology, she emphasizes, is not about finding a specific object to validate a predetermined belief. It's a systematic method of asking research questions and investigating material culture to answer them. That indicates that the search for Noah's Ark is unsuccessful on every level. Nonetheless, the draw remains. Mount Ararat, a snow-capped volcano in eastern Turkey, has long been the most popular candidate for the Ark's final resting place, due largely to a biblical reference in Genesis. In 1876, British politician and explorer James Bryce climbed Ararat and claimed to have found a piece of ancient wood at a high elevation, wood that he believed must have come from the Arkansas. Bryce's story inspired others, fueling a frenzy that has continued well into the modern era despite the lack of scientific support for his assertion. In recent decades, groups like Noah's Ark Scans, led by researchers such as Andrew Jones, have pointed to the Durupinner site, a boat-shaped formation near Ararat, as compelling evidence. They claim that soil samples taken from the site contain organic matter inconsistent with the surrounding geology. But geologists overwhelmingly conclude that the formation is a natural phenomenon, a result of erosion and sedimentation, not a decayed hull of biblical proportions. Even the most optimistic interpretations are marred by a complete lack of context. No tools, no inscriptions, no datable human remains. In the eyes of most scholars, there is no there. Complicating matters further is the fact that the Bible itself is frustratingly vague. The Ark is said to have come to rest on the mountains of Ararat, not Mount Ararat itself, a critical distinction as Ararat refers to a broader region once part of the ancient kingdom of Urartu, encompassing parts of modern Armenia, Iran, and Turkey. Thus, even if one accepted the story as literal history, pinpointing an exact location would be impossible. Add to that the centuries of earthquakes, erosion, and environmental changes in the region, and the chances of locating a 4,000-year-old wooden vessel become essentially nil. Furthermore, the idea that a wooden structure could survive millennia, exposed to the elements or even buried beneath glacial ice, is improbable in the extreme. Organic materials decay rapidly without constant preservation conditions, and wood is especially vulnerable. Even those who believe in a global flood often concede this. Andrew Snelling, a geologist affiliated with Answers in Genesis, a ministry that supports young Earth creationism, argues that the Ark was likely dismantled by Noah and his family for building materials after they disembarked. In a post-Diluvian world with no existing shelters or mature trees, repurposing the Ark's timber would have been both practical and necessary. He suggests that even if the Ark once existed, no trace of it should be expected to remain. And yet, ironically, this acknowledgement has not slowed the flood of Ark discoveries over the years. Every few years, headlines trumpet the definitive discovery of Noah's Ark, only for the claims to crumble under scrutiny. Often, these so-called discoveries are based on vague satellite images, misidentified rock formations, or anecdotal accounts with no archaeological verification. The motivations behind these claims vary. Some are rooted in sincere belief, others in financial interest, and some in the desire for notoriety. But the pattern is consistent: bold claims, little evidence, and immediate skepticism from the scientific community. Behind all this lies a deeper conflict between faith and science, myth and material evidence. Stories of a great flood are not unique to the Bible. Similar narratives appear in numerous ancient cultures. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text dating back to the early 2nd millennium BC, features a strikingly similar flood story, with a righteous man named Utnapishtim instructed to build a boat and save life from divine wrath. Other flood myths appear in Babylonian, Sumerian, and even Native American and Asian traditions. This universality suggests that such stories may have emerged independently as a way to explain local catastrophes or as cultural metaphors for rebirth and destruction. Indeed, geological evidence points to the likelihood of major flood events in various regions throughout history. One prominent theory posits that a catastrophic flooding event occurred in the Black Sea region around 7,500 years ago, possibly inspiring Near Eastern flood legends. But even this cannot be directly linked to the biblical flood, much less to a literal Noah or an Arkansas. Eric Klein, an archaeologist and National Geographic explorer, suggests that the ubiquity of flood myths reflects a shared human experience. Flooding is a common natural disaster after all, not proof of a singular worldwide event. For serious archaeologists like Magnus and Klein, the obsession with Noah's Ark is not just misguided, it's a missed opportunity. There is an entire world of rich, meaningful archaeological discovery in the ancient Near East, much of which does align with elements of the biblical narrative. The discovery of the Tel Dan stele, for example, provides extra-biblical evidence for the existence of the House of David. Ongoing digs at sites like Tel Kabri and Megiddo have unearthed evidence of Canaanite palaces, trade networks, and religious practices that correspond in broad strokes with biblical history. These findings illuminate the world in which the Bible was written, helping scholars understand the cultural and political contexts of the texts, not validate their literal claims. Yet these genuine discoveries receive far less attention than the latest unverified Ark sighting. The influence of popular media, as both scholars point out, is a component of the issue. Hollywood blockbusters and sensational documentaries have conditioned the public to expect archaeology to work like an Indiana Jones adventure, a breathless race through booby-trapped temples to uncover world-changing relics. The reality, of course, is far less glamorous. Real archaeology is slow, methodical, and rarely yields definitive answers. It is the cumulative work of years, even decades, of excavation, analysis, and peer-reviewed publication. But to a public raised on cinematic thrills, a painted palace floor doesn't hold a candle to a mythical boat found on a remote mountaintop. That dissonance between expectation and reality has given rise to what scholars call pseudo-archaeology, a field of inquiry that mimics the trappings of science but lacks its rigor. In this worldview, the Ark is not just a religious symbol but a holy grail, its discovery a validation of faith and a rebuke to secular skepticism. Yet this approach undermines both religious belief and scientific credibility. As Klein observes, people are going to believe what they want to believe. He has long since given up trying to debunk Ark claims. Instead, he focuses on his own fieldwork, such as the excavation of a Canaanite palace at Tel Kabri, which has yielded insights into trade, art, and diplomacy from nearly 4,000 years ago. Although it may not be a miraculous wooden ship, it is significantly more significant to him and serious archaeologists. In the end, the question, "Where is Noah's Ark?" may be the wrong one to ask. It implies that a literal object from a mythical story exists somewhere in the real world, waiting to be found. But myths are not always meant to be factual. They are meant to teach, to inspire, to encode values and fears into memorable narratives. The story of Noah's Ark speaks to themes of judgment, redemption, faith, and human frailty. It has endured for millennia not because it can be proven, but because it resonates. And in that sense, perhaps it doesn't need to be found. Perhaps the search itself says more about us. Our longing for certainty, our need for connection to the divine, our hunger for stories that make the world make sense, than about anything that might lie buried in the rocks of Ararat. Noah's Ark may never be discovered. But maybe, just maybe, it was never meant to be. Where is Noah's Ark? Here's why it will never be found. For more than a century, explorers, archaeologists, and religious enthusiasts have searched for the remains of Noah's Ark, the legendary vessel described in the book of Genesis that saved humanity and animal life from a catastrophic flood. There has never been conclusive evidence of the Ark, despite numerous claims of its discovery, including boat-shaped geological formations in eastern Turkey and wooden fragments on Mount Ararat. The quest, often fueled by faith rather than science, continues to captivate the public imagination, but archaeologists and biblical scholars remain deeply skeptical. In fact, most experts dismiss the search as a fool's errand, arguing that the Ark, if it ever existed, will never be found, not because it's hidden, but because the very nature of the story makes it archaeologically untraceable. The biblical account and its origins. The story of Noah's Ark is one of the most enduring narratives in the Hebrew Bible. According to Genesis, God, angered by humanity's wickedness, decided to send a worldwide flood to cleanse the earth. Only Noah, a righteous man, and his family were spared, along with pairs of every animal species, all of whom survived inside a massive wooden ark. After 40 days and nights of rain, the floodwaters receded, and the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8 verse 4. For those who interpret the Bible as literal history, this account demands a real, physical ark that once existed and could, in theory, be discovered. But archaeologists point out that flood myths predate the Hebrew Bible by centuries. The most famous parallel is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian tale from the early 2nd millennium BC, which features a nearly identical story of a man named Utnapishtim who builds a giant boat to survive a divine flood. Even older is the Atrahasis epic, circa 18th century BC, and a recently deciphered Babylonian cuneiform tablet from around 1750 BC describes detailed construction techniques for an ark-like vessel. These similarities suggest that the Genesis flood story was not an original account but rather a reworking of earlier Mesopotamian myths, adapted to fit Israelite theology. If the story is a theological allegory rather than a historical record, then searching for a physical ark is as futile as hunting for the Tower of Babel or the Garden of Eden. The geological evidence, or lack thereof. Some researchers argue that flood myths could be based on real, catastrophic deluges in ancient history. One prominent theory, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, suggests that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake until around 5600 BC, when rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus, causing a massive flood that displaced early farming communities. This event, they argue, could have inspired flood legends. However, even if such a flood occurred, it was regional, not global, and happened thousands of years before the earliest written flood myths. More importantly, there is no geological evidence of a worldwide flood that would match the biblical description. Sediment layers, ice core samples, and fossil records show no signs of a planet-covering deluge within the last 10,000 years. The problem of Mount Ararat. The Bible states that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a reference to the ancient kingdom of Urartu, modern-day Armenia and eastern Turkey, not necessarily the 16,854-foot volcanic peak known today as Mount Ararat. Despite this, many ark hunters fixate on this mountain, partly due to its imposing presence and partly due to medieval traditions that placed the ark there. Explorers have claimed to find the ark on Ararat for centuries. In 1876, British politician James Bryce reported discovering a 4-foot-long piece of wood near the summit, which he declared was from the Arkansas. In the 20th century, multiple expeditions, some led by evangelical Christians, others by amateur adventurers, claimed to have spotted the ark's remains in aerial photos or through ground-penetrating radar. Most well-knownly, in the 1950s and 1960s, French explorer Fernand Navarre claimed to have found wooden beams on the mountain. However, testing revealed that the wood was only about 1,300 years old, which is far too recent to be from Noah's time.